When I first asked him to help me with my back pain, I didn't mean anything by it. It was an innocent moment, really, it was. I had barely slept for days. My shoulder had been stiff and aching, and I was too tired to even complain properly. My husband had nodded distractedly from behind his laptop, offering no real concern, and then his son, my stepson, looked up from his seat at the kitchen table and said, "I can help, if you want." I should have said no. I should have smiled politely, deflected. But instead, I heard myself saying, "That would be nice." He followed me into the living room with a bottle of cream in his hand, and I remember thinking how absurd it all was. But his touch wasn't absurd. It was focused. Careful. Attentive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And when it was over, I thanked him like it was nothing, like my skin hadn't just remembered something it had forgotten. I told myself I was overreacting. That it was nothing more than kindness. But in the silence that followed, something inside me twisted. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay beside my husband, listening to the sound of his even breath, and stared at the ceiling. That moment, it shouldn't have mattered. But it did. And I need to tell you how it happened, all of it, before judgment fills your thoughts. Before you assume you know what kind of woman I am. Just listen. And before I share the truth I've kept buried, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and be honest, have you ever crossed a line you promised yourself you never would? There's something suffocating about silence when it comes from someone you used to share everything with. Not a heavy silence, not the kind that shouts with tension or anger. No, this one is quieter. Polite. Like we were colleagues who used to be close, but not anymore. That's how it feels most mornings with my husband. We sit at the same table. Drink the same coffee. Talk about the weather, or the news, or what groceries we're out of. It's not fighting. It's the absence of even that. I'm not saying he's cruel. He's not. He still does the dishes after dinner. He still checks the locks before bed. But he hasn't really looked at me in a long time. Not looked. Not like he used to. I think we both started living next to each other instead of with each other. And somewhere along the way, that became normal. The pain in my shoulder started as a tightness that wouldn't go away. I thought it would pass, like everything else. But a few days later, it crept into my neck and then down my back. It was a dull throb that made sleeping harder, and mornings even worse. I mentioned it to my husband at breakfast. "My back's been killing me lately," I said, rubbing my shoulder absently. He didn't look up from his phone. "You should get a heating pad," he murmured. I nodded. Of course. A heating pad. That evening, I was sitting on the couch, leaning into a pillow, trying to ease the ache, when I noticed him, my stepson, watching me from the kitchen. He was in town for a few weeks, between projects, visiting before heading back to his work out west. We'd always gotten along. Respectfully distant, like two people sharing a house temporarily. "Need help?" he asked, nodding toward my shoulder. I blinked. "It's fine," I said. But he tilted his head, unconvinced. "I took a sports massage course last year," he said. "Part of a certification thing. I can try, if you want." I hesitated. Not because I was afraid of anything improper, but because I wasn't used to being offered care. Especially not so directly. But the pain pulsed in my shoulder, and I was tired. "Sure," I said quietly. He went upstairs and returned with a small bottle of massage lotion. I led him to the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, and pulled my hair to one side. I felt awkward, suddenly aware of my robe slipping at the neck, of the bare skin between my shoulder blades. His hands were steady. Gentle, but firm. He didn't say much. I didn't either. The only sound was the quiet clock ticking and the faint hum of the refrigerator. His thumbs worked along the tight muscles with a focus that startled me. It wasn't about attraction. Not then. It was about being touched in a way that was present. I realized I'd forgotten what that felt like. "Better?" he asked, stepping back after a few minutes. I turned to look at him. "Yeah," I said. "Thank you." He gave a small nod and went back upstairs. I stayed seated for a long time. My shoulder felt better. Looser. But inside me, something had tensed. Later that night, I lay beside my husband. He scrolled through his phone, reading something with a faint smile. I wanted to tell him about the massage, about how helpful it was. But I didn't. Not because it was a secret, but because I knew exactly what he'd say. "Good," he'd murmur, not looking up. And that would be it. The next morning, I tried not to think about it. I put on a sweater that hugged my figure a little more than usual. I told myself it was because it was cold. Because the other one was in the laundry. I made coffee. Sat at the table. We all exchanged pleasantries. But I noticed his glance. Not overt, just a flicker. From across the room. I noticed, and my skin warmed, and I hated that I noticed. I spent most of the day pretending not to think about anything. Cleaned the upstairs bathroom. Reorganized the spice rack. Watered the houseplants even though they didn't need it. By evening, my back had stiffened again. And I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I sat in the same place on the couch. Watched the same show. My husband beside me, quiet, content. Not touching. My thoughts wandered to that moment again. His hands. The silence. The feeling of being seen, even for just a few minutes. I wondered why that simple gesture had stayed with me. Why it left such a mark. And I wondered how long I'd been starving for something I hadn't realized I needed. When I finally went to bed that night, I lay on my side and pulled the blanket over my shoulder. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. But my mind kept circling back to one simple truth. That moment shouldn't have mattered. But it did. The next morning, I took longer getting dressed. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair more slowly than usual, noticing the way it fell across my shoulders. I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in months, one with soft fabric that hugged the curve of my waist. It wasn't revealing, not really. But it wasn't one of my usual choices either. I told myself it was because we might go out later. Maybe a trip to the grocery store or the cafe down the street. That's what I told myself. Downstairs, the kitchen was already filled with the smell of coffee. He stood by the window, a mug in hand, the morning light catching on his jaw. I paused in the doorway longer than I should have. He turned, met my gaze briefly, and offered a quiet smile. Not a knowing smile. Just gentle. I nodded in return, trying to keep my expression unreadable. My husband sat at the table, reading the news on his tablet, oblivious to anything beyond the screen. He muttered something about the price of gas, and I responded with a sound that could mean anything. My stepson poured another cup of coffee and asked if I wanted some. I said yes. We sat there like any other morning, but I could feel something fragile stretched between us. Something too delicate to touch, yet impossible to ignore. Later, I stood by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. I was holding my mug with both hands, more for comfort than warmth. He passed behind me on the way to the hallway, close enough that I felt the air shift. That tiny movement, that silent presence, it was more than I'd felt from my husband in weeks. I wasn't proud of the way my thoughts lingered. I wasn't proud that I remembered the pressure of his hands on my shoulders. The way he didn't rush. The way I felt seen. The day stretched on, mostly uneventful. My husband left for a client meeting around noon. I cleaned the kitchen, vacuumed the rug, folded laundry. Normal things. Meaningless things. But even then, I felt unsettled, like I was walking through fog, pretending the path was still familiar. I heard the door open and shut later in the afternoon, soft footsteps across the hall. My heart gave a strange thud, like it had been waiting for something. I didn't look up right away. It was just him, moving through the space, calm as ever. He asked how I was feeling. I said I was better. He nodded. That was it. No mention of yesterday. No awkwardness. And yet every moment hung suspended, like it might fall and shatter if either of us reached for it. I went outside to water the plants. The late spring sun was warm on my face, and I let it linger there for a while. I needed to ground myself. I needed to remember who I was, where the lines were, and why they mattered. But even as I stood among the garden beds, I kept thinking about how it felt to be cared for. How long it had been since someone had asked how I was and actually meant it. In the evening, we were in the kitchen again. He was chopping vegetables for dinner. I was setting the table. Our movements were quiet, practiced. But there was something else, something pulsing beneath the surface. A current neither of us acknowledged. He handed me the cutting board so I could slide the contents into the pan. Our fingers brushed. Only for a second. But my breath caught anyway. He looked up, eyes meeting mine, and there it was. The pause. The hesitation. The moment of decision. We kissed. No words. No explanation. Just that. I stepped back first. The heat rushed to my face, and I turned quickly toward the stove. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We ate dinner like nothing had happened. My husband came home just after, his presence filling the space like furniture no one wanted to move. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day. I smiled, answered vaguely, kept my voice steady. That night, I stood in the bathroom, brushing my teeth with robotic precision. My reflection stared back, unreadable. I wiped away a smudge from the corner of the mirror, more out of habit than concern. In bed, I turned off the lamp and slid under the covers beside my husband. He was already asleep, or pretending to be. His breathing was slow, steady. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing the thoughts out of my head. But they came anyway. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't chased. It happened like a breath, natural, involuntary. And now it sat between us, invisible but undeniable. I thought about boundaries. About vows. About the quiet erosion of intimacy that no one ever talks about. About how easy it is to miss someone who's sleeping right beside you. I wasn't in love. Not with the man who kissed me, and maybe not anymore with the one I married. I didn't know what I was. But I knew that one small moment had changed something. And I didn't know how to go back. There are moments in life that feel like echoes, small and quiet at first, but they return to you again and again, growing louder every time. That kiss became one of them. It wasn't grand. It wasn't passionate. It was simple. Brief. But it didn't leave. It stayed with me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The next morning, I didn't look at him. Not out of shame, but because I didn't know how. I didn't trust myself. I couldn't predict what I might see in his face, or worse, what he might see in mine. So I kept to my routines. Brushed my hair, made the bed, folded the laundry that had been sitting untouched for 3 days. Normal things, dull things. I clung to them like armor. At breakfast, We sat like statues. My husband scrolled through his phone. My stepson poured himself orange juice and drank it standing up. I buttered my toast with the precision of a surgeon. No one said much. There was nothing to say. Not then. Later that day, my husband announced he'd be leaving for a short business trip, 2, maybe 3 nights. Something about a meeting that couldn't be postponed. I nodded, pretending it didn't matter. But as soon as he mentioned it, I felt my stomach drop. Not because I feared being left alone, but because I feared what being alone might lead to. He left in the afternoon. I stood at the door, waved him off, watched his car disappear around the corner. The house fell quiet. Too quiet. I closed the door slowly and leaned my back against it, unsure what came next. Upstairs, I heard music, soft, rhythmic. His room. I considered retreating to mine, losing myself in a book, taking a bath, anything to fill the space. But instead, I walked to the kitchen and made tea. Not because I wanted it. I just needed to keep my hands busy. He came down not long after. His face was neutral, unreadable. But I noticed the way he paused when he saw me at the counter, the slight hitch in his step, the flicker of something across his expression before he looked away. We danced around each other for the rest of the day. He stayed mostly in his room. I stayed mostly downstairs. We exchanged a few casual words, about groceries, the mail, the weather. Every sentence was wrapped in cotton, soft and careful. By evening, I was sitting on the couch, legs curled beneath me, the television playing some show I wasn't following. He entered the room quietly and sat at the far end. We were separated by a cushion and a world of silence. I don't know how long we sat there. The light in the room dimmed with the setting sun, and neither of us moved to turn on a lamp. It felt like waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. Eventually, he spoke. His voice low, almost hesitant. About the other day. I turned to him. It was a mistake, I said quickly, not because I believed it, but because I thought I should. He nodded slowly, but didn't agree. Didn't argue either. Just let the words sit between us. I reached for the remote, turned off the television. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I'm going to bed, I said after a moment. He nodded again. I stood, feeling the weight of his gaze follow me down the hallway. In my room, I shut the door, but didn't lock it. Not on purpose, it simply didn't occur to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, unsure what I was trying to feel. Shame? Regret? Relief? None of them came. Instead, I felt suspended, as if the days had stopped moving and I was trapped in the stillness. The next day passed much the same. We kept our distance. We spoke only when necessary. But the air felt charged, like the calm before a summer storm. That afternoon, I was struggling with the vacuum cleaner. Something had clogged it, and I'd crouched down, trying to fix it, when I heard footsteps behind me. Need help? He asked. I froze for a second, then stood, brushing dust from my hands. It's fine, I said. He stepped forward anyway, kneeling beside the machine. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same latch. I pulled mine back too quickly, as if burned. He looked up at me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. We didn't kiss. We didn't touch. But something shifted again, just slightly, like a floorboard creaking under weight you didn't expect. That evening, I found myself restless. I wandered the house aimlessly, pausing at windows, adjusting picture frames that didn't need adjusting. The ache in my shoulder had returned, dull and persistent. I told myself not to ask. I told myself to take a warm shower instead, to go to bed early, to forget the tension that had been growing between us like a vine curling toward sunlight. But after dinner, as I stood at the sink rinsing dishes, I spoke without thinking. "My back's worse again," I said. I hadn't meant to say it aloud. But once the words were there, I couldn't take them back. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Do you want me to help?" I turned slowly. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't leering. He was just standing there, waiting. I could have said no. I should have. But I didn't. "Yes," I said. We didn't go to the living room. This time, I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, where the lighting was softer, more forgiving. He stood behind me again, hands gentle but firm. The rhythm of his movements was slow, deliberate. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the relief, not the reaction. But my skin betrayed me. Every press of his fingers sent ripples through places I didn't want to acknowledge. I felt my breathing change. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the one that had nothing to do with muscles or bones. When he finished, he rested his hands briefly on my shoulders. I could feel the weight of them, the warmth. Then they were gone. I didn't turn to look at him. I couldn't. "Thank you," I said softly. He murmured something in return, then left the room. I sat there for a long time, unmoving. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, eyes open, the ceiling dark above me. My body was calm. My thoughts were not. I had crossed no lines that evening, not outwardly. But inside, 1,000 lines had blurred. And I didn't know if I could find my way back. The following morning unfolded with a sort of mechanical rhythm, the kind that comes not from peace but from necessity. I moved through the motions of my routine, making the bed, brushing my hair, preparing coffee, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The silence in the house was deeper than usual. Not oppressive, just aware. Like a presence watching from the corners, waiting to be acknowledged. My husband was still away. He hadn't called, and I hadn't reached out. That wasn't unusual for us. We had long stopped checking in during trips. There was trust, I suppose, or maybe just indifference masked as trust. Either way, his absence didn't register as freedom or loss, it just was. By mid-morning, I found myself reorganizing the pantry. Not because it needed it. Not because I cared about labels facing forward or expiration dates lined up in a row. I just needed something, anything, to keep my hands busy while my mind paced circles around itself. He came downstairs around noon. I could hear the creak of the steps, the quiet footfalls. I didn't turn to look. I kept my focus on a box of rice that was already in the right place. He entered the kitchen, said a casual good morning, and I responded with the same. There was nothing else. Just the clinking of dishes as he poured himself a glass of water. That afternoon, I suggested we drive to the market in the next town. It was spontaneous, which wasn't like me. I told him I needed a few things, some fresh herbs, maybe a bottle of wine for when my husband returned. But really, I just needed to get out of the house. The air inside had grown thick with unspoken things, and I needed to breathe something else. He agreed without hesitation. Maybe he needed the same. The drive was quiet. I kept the windows cracked to let in the breeze. The road was familiar, winding through green fields and soft hills, but it felt different somehow. As if we were moving through a painting instead of reality. We didn't speak much. A few words about traffic, the weather, the time of day. But the silence between those words wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like something shared, like a fragile understanding. At the market, we walked side by side. I picked out vegetables with more attention than they warranted. He carried the basket. Occasionally, our arms brushed. Each time, my skin reacted with an awareness I couldn't suppress. It wasn't desire in the way I'd once understood it. It was something quieter, more dangerous, his curiosity tinged with memory. We stopped at a small cafe before heading back. The kind with chipped mugs and handwritten menus. He ordered black coffee. I asked for tea. We sat by the window, watching the street. Across from us, a couple in their 20s held hands across the table, laughing at something only they understood. I caught myself staring. Not out of envy, but recognition. I remembered what that had felt like, being in sync with someone, without words, without trying. He noticed my gaze but didn't comment. Instead, he asked if I came here often. I said no. That I used to, years ago, but hadn't been back in a long time. We left it at that. On the drive home, the radio played a song I hadn't heard in years. One of those bittersweet melodies that make you nostalgic for a moment you never actually had. I didn't say anything, but he turned the volume up slightly, as if he understood. Back home, we unpacked the groceries in silence. I placed the herbs in a small jar of water on the counter. He handed me the wine bottle, and our fingers touched briefly. This time, I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then turned away. Later, I went to my room to change. The house was still quiet. I looked at myself in the mirror, my reflection tired but sharp. I changed into something soft, loose. Something I could breathe in. I wandered into the hallway and paused outside his room. The door was open, the light on. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, reading something on his phone. I should have kept walking. I should have turned and gone back downstairs. But I didn't. He looked up when he noticed me. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. I was thinking, I said, keeping my voice even, maybe we could finish that show tonight. The one we started. He nodded slowly. Sure. That evening, we sat on the couch again. Not as far apart as before, but not close either. The show played on, and I tried to follow it. I really did. But my mind was elsewhere, on the space between us, on the steady beat of my own heart. At some point, I realized I hadn't moved in several minutes. I was holding my breath. Not literally, but emotionally. I felt suspended, like any motion might cause a collapse. He shifted beside me. Not toward me. Not away. Just shifted. It was enough. I stood up abruptly, said something about being tired, and walked toward the hallway. My footsteps sounded too loud. I felt his eyes on me, but I didn't turn around. In the bathroom, I stared at myself again. Not to check makeup or fix my hair. Just to see if I still looked like me. I ran cold water over my wrists, a habit from years ago, when emotions threatened to overflow. It didn't work as well anymore. Before bed, I checked my phone. No messages from my husband. I didn't feel disappointed. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my journal, an old habit I hadn't touched in months. I started writing, not knowing what would come out. I miss being seen, I wrote. Not heard. Not understood. Seen. I closed the journal without signing my name. The words felt like someone else's, but also mine. That night, I lay awake again, listening to the silence. But this time, it wasn't comforting. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything I hadn't said. Everything I couldn't say. And I knew we were getting closer to a line I wasn't sure I'd recognize until it was far behind me. The day began without consequence. Morning light stretched slowly across the bedroom wall, crawling in soft gradients over the furniture, gently waking the room before it woke me. I lay still for a while, not out of restfulness, but because I didn't want to meet my own thoughts too quickly. The quiet was comforting in its simplicity, no ringing phones, no clinking dishes, no questions waiting to be answered. I moved slowly through my routine, as if by slowing time I could postpone something unnamed but inevitable. My husband was still away. He had sent a brief message the night before, a generic check-in followed by a late goodnight. I responded with something equally minimal. We were polite these days. Our exchanges resembled those of long-distance colleagues rather than lovers or partners. Downstairs, the house felt lived in but still. A faint trace of last night's dinner hung in the air. A wine glass left unwashed on the counter, crumbs near the breadboard, small signs that life had happened here, but nothing of significance. I wiped down the surface more forcefully than necessary, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to feel resolved. He emerged around the same time he always did, freshly showered, his hair slightly damp, shirt wrinkled just enough to suggest comfort, not carelessness. He greeted me softly, and I returned it just as gently. I didn't look at him too long. I couldn't. Not without remembering the silence that had grown between us the night before, like a vine crawling across walls neither of us built consciously. That afternoon, we stayed mostly out of each other's way. I worked on emails I'd been avoiding. He read or pretended to read, sitting in the sunroom with a book that rarely turned a page. We existed near one another, floating in the tension that had become so familiar it almost felt normal. By late afternoon, I realized I had nothing left in the fridge for dinner. I mentioned it casually, suggesting we pick up something. He offered to drive. I agreed without thought, grateful for an excuse to leave the house. The drive to the store was uneventful, filled with short, functional sentences. We walked through the aisles together like strangers forced into small talk, suggesting pasta, debating sauces, deciding against dessert. But even with the mundane, there was a hum underneath. Not a thrill. Not desire. Something more muted. Weightier. In the car on the way back, it started to rain. Not heavily, but enough to blur the windshield. He turned on the wipers, and the rhythmic squeak filled the silence between us. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The quiet between us was no longer awkward. It was shared. Back at home, I poured us each a glass of wine while he unpacked the groceries. I set the table slowly, aligning the forks and napkins with careful precision, as though symmetry could soothe chaos. Dinner passed quietly. Our conversation hovered around safe topics, nothing intimate, nothing real. But it wasn't forced. It was like two people carefully maintaining a balance neither wanted to break, yet neither was ready to release. Afterward, he reached for the empty wine bottle, raised an eyebrow, and I nodded. Another one then. I didn't protest. We moved to the living room. The rain had stopped, but the windows were still streaked, catching reflections from the dim light above. I sat on one end of the couch, legs tucked beneath me. He sat on the other, glass in hand. We talked more freely now. Not about us, but about childhood memories, silly moments, random details that didn't belong to anyone else in the house. We were building something small and fragile in the space between us, and we both knew it. At one point, he made a joke, dry, unexpected. I laughed, more than I should have, and set my glass down to cover my mouth. When I looked at him, he was already watching me. His expression was unreadable, not guarded, but thoughtful. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. We kissed. No words. No explanation. Just that. I don't know how long it lasted. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was still. When we pulled apart, we didn't apologize. We didn't explain. There was no nervous laughter, no sudden retreat. Just silence. A silence that said everything and nothing. I stood up first. Not abruptly, not out of panic. I just needed air. Space. Time to breathe. I walked to the kitchen, rinsed my glass, set it in the sink. My hands shook slightly, not from fear or guilt, but from recognition. Something had shifted again. This time, there would be no returning to before. When I came back, he was still sitting there. Still quiet. Still watching me. I didn't say anything. I just picked up the folded blanket on the arm of the chair and draped it over his lap. "Good night," I said. He nodded. In my room, I didn't sleep right away. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor. My mind didn't race. It wandered slowly, as though walking through a thick fog. I thought of my husband. Of how long it had been since we'd sat on the couch like that, shared laughter like that, exchanged glances that lingered. I thought of how long it had been since I'd felt touched, truly touched, not physically, but emotionally, seen and heard in a way that settled into your skin. I thought of the version of myself that had once sworn certain lines would never be crossed. That version felt far away now. Not gone. Just outgrown. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again, waiting for sleep to take me. But it didn't. It never did on nights like this. Nights that held the weight of too much clarity. There had been 2 kisses now. 2 moments that I couldn't take back. And both times, I hadn't tried. The morning after was gray and muted, a light drizzle tapping against the windows, soft and persistent. I awoke early, not because I was rested but because sleep had become shallow, filled with interrupted dreams and half-formed thoughts. The house was still, the air inside unusually heavy, like it had absorbed everything we hadn't said the night before. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, trying to sort through the quiet storm in my mind. There was no guilt, not in the way I had expected. But there was weight, undeniable and dense. The realization that something irreversible had begun. And I had allowed it. When I finally got up, I moved through the hallway slowly, listening for sounds. There were none. I made my way to the kitchen, started the coffee machine, and stood at the counter watching the dark liquid drip into the carafe. The familiar scent brought no comfort. He came down a few minutes later. I heard him before I saw him, barefoot steps on the hardwood, the slight creak of the stairs. When he entered the kitchen, we exchanged a glance that held too many things to name. We didn't speak. I poured him a cup of coffee, slid it across the counter. He nodded in silent thanks. We stood like that for a few moments, the space between us full of tension and restraint. Then, without a word, he picked up his mug and walked back into the other room. I stayed behind, staring at the steam rising from my own cup, wondering what came next. Later that day, I found myself pacing. Not in a dramatic way, but in small aimless circles, kitchen to hallway, hallway to living room back to kitchen. I couldn't focus. Every task I tried to start felt unnecessary. Every room felt too confined. Eventually, I stopped at the front window, arms crossed tightly around myself. Outside, the rain had eased into mist. The street was empty, the trees swaying lightly. I stood there longer than I should have, not thinking, just existing. At some point, I opened my phone and stared at my husband's most recent message. It was 2 sentences long. Informative, efficient, entirely void of affection. I didn't reply. Instead, I booked a massage appointment. A real one. A legitimate place I hadn't visited in years. I told myself I needed it, for my back, for my tension, for my sanity. But beneath that excuse lay something else. Something deeper and more difficult to name. He didn't ask where I was going when I grabbed my coat. I said I'd be back in an hour. He nodded, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine he wasn't reading. The drive was uneventful. The parking lot half full. The receptionist recognized me vaguely but didn't ask too many questions. I lay on the table in a dimly lit room while soft music played overhead. The therapist's hands were skilled, professional, impersonal. And yet, with every touch, I couldn't stop comparing. The warmth I had felt a few nights ago wasn't present here. The touch now was mechanical, practiced. There was no energy. No danger. No confusion. I should have felt safe. But I didn't. Back home, I walked through the door with a strange emptiness. My muscles were looser, but my chest felt tighter. He looked up from the couch when I entered. I met his gaze, but neither of us spoke. The day wore on like that. I cooked dinner. He helped with cleanup. We moved around each other in quiet coordination, like a pair of dancers rehearsing old steps. But it was different now. Everything was. After the dishes were done, I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching him as he dried the plates one by one. There was nothing remarkable about the moment, yet it felt weighted. As though the air had thickened between us again. Later, as I walked through the hallway, I noticed the door to the guest room slightly ajar. Something inside me pulled me toward it. I hesitated only briefly before stepping in. He was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, writing something in a small notebook. He didn't hear me at first. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between surprise and inevitability. I just wanted to say, "Thank you," I said. "For what?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I shrugged. "For being kind. For being here." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to thank me for that." I stood in the doorway a moment longer, unsure whether to step in or back away. But I didn't do either. I just stayed there, suspended in the space between two decisions. Eventually, I said goodnight and turned back toward my room. As I closed the door behind me, I felt something catch in my chest. Not pain. Not relief. Just a pause. A full breath that refused to release. That night, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat by the window for a long time, knees pulled up to my chest, watching the streetlights flicker against the mist. The house was quiet. No footsteps. No creaking floorboards. Just the sound of my own breath, steady but uncertain. I picked up my journal again, turned to a blank page, and let my pen hover above the paper. This time, I wrote. I'm not sure who I'm becoming. But I know she's not the woman I was. And then. Is it wrong to want to feel awake? I set the journal down and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my body like armor. My mind wandered again, back to every choice I'd made in the last few days. They hadn't been dramatic. They hadn't been explosive. But they had been real. And they had changed me. I closed my eyes and waited for morning, knowing that what came next wouldn't be simple. But it would be honest. And maybe that was enough. My husband came home the next morning. The sound of the front door opening jolted me from a shallow sleep. I had drifted off just before sunrise, too restless to surrender to the night but too tired to resist the weight of my body any longer. I lay still in bed, eyes open, listening to the familiar rhythm of his footsteps, the low creak of leather as he set his bag down in the hallway, the brief rustling of fabric as he removed his coat. It was all so ordinary. So practiced. As if nothing had shifted in the days he'd been away. I sat up slowly, wrapping my robe tightly around me. My heart wasn't racing, but something inside me twisted, not panic, not regret. Something quieter. Something settled. I came downstairs to find him in the kitchen, already halfway through making coffee. He looked up when he saw me, offered a soft smile. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. He nodded and turned back to the coffee pot, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. No embrace. No question of how I'd been. No acknowledgement of absence or change. Just a refill of routine. We sat together at the table while the coffee brewed, each of us nursing silence like a fragile cup. He spoke about his meetings, his hotel room, the dinner he had with some clients. I listened, nodding at appropriate moments, offering brief affirmations. I didn't ask questions. I didn't have any I wanted answers to. The door to the guest room was closed. He never asked about it. Later, I folded laundry in the living room, mechanically pairing socks, smoothing shirts, aligning corners of towels. He passed through the room once, heading toward the den, his phone pressed to his ear. He gave me a passing glance, then disappeared again. It occurred to me that we had perfected the art of avoidance. Not through conflict, but through choreography. We moved around each other without ever colliding, without even touching. By mid-afternoon, the weather turned warmer. I opened the windows to let in the breeze. It carried the faint scent of grass and early spring blossoms. The sound of birds filtered in, distant but clear. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the movement of branches, the quiet flutter of leaves. He entered the kitchen behind me. I heard the chair scrape across the floor as he sat. I didn't turn. After a moment, he said, "Feels like winter's finally letting go." I nodded. It does. The conversation ended there. Another sentence to mark time, not meaning. He left again not long after, something about a follow-up meeting, a client that had extended their stay nearby. I nodded, said I'd see him later, and closed the door behind him with an odd sense of relief. The house returned to stillness. But it wasn't the same. There was a hum under the quiet now. A different awareness. I could feel it in my skin, my breath, my spine. He emerged from the guest room just after the door clicked shut. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We met eyes only briefly, then parted again, he to the back patio, I to the hallway. I found myself cleaning again. Wiping windows that weren't dirty. Dusting picture frames that hadn't moved in months. It was easier to handle the surface of things than to dive beneath them. By evening, I was in the kitchen again, chopping vegetables for dinner I wasn't sure I'd finish. I worked slowly, methodically, letting the rhythm of the knife calm my hands. He stood at the edge of the room, leaning against the doorway, saying nothing. "I'm cooking too much," I said, almost to myself. He took a step forward. "I can help." I didn't answer right away. Then I gestured to the cutting board, slid it toward him. We cooked in silence. Side by side. Movements fluid, restrained. The air between us was full of what had been said without words. Afterward, we sat down at the table. Just the two of us. My husband hadn't returned. The clock ticked audibly in the background, a metronome for the tension. We didn't look at each other much. We didn't need to. It wasn't like the previous dinners. There was no nervousness. No glances quickly turned away. There was only stillness, and something beneath it that neither of us could name. After dinner, I washed the dishes. He dried them. I handed him a plate and our fingers touched. A pause. A breath. I looked at him. He looked at me. No one spoke. And then, we spent the night together. There are things I won't describe. Not because they were improper, but because they were private. Not physical. Not graphic. But intimate. Emotionally precise. Quiet. Human. We didn't speak before. We didn't speak after. But in the spaces between words, something profound passed between us. The next morning, the sun rose early. Light crept across the floor, warming the quiet corners of the room. I opened my eyes to find him already up, already dressed. He stood by the window, looking out toward the street. When I sat up, he turned, met my gaze, and nodded once, almost like goodbye. I didn't stop him when he left the room. I didn't ask what came next. I didn't even know what I hoped the answer would be. I stayed in bed a while longer, staring at the ceiling. My heart felt quiet. Not settled, but not storming either. The house was still again. But I wasn't the same woman who had stood in that kitchen days ago, asking for a back rub, pretending that loneliness wasn't something to be acknowledged. Something had changed. And I couldn't pretend it hadn't. I woke up with the distinct sensation that something had been reset. Not erased, no, nothing could be undone now, but as if the world had shifted slightly overnight, nudging everything a few degrees to the side. The sheets were still warm on my skin, but the bed beside me was empty. I sat up slowly, gathering the blanket around my shoulders like armor. The house was quiet, as it usually was in the early hours. But this silence felt different, thicker, denser. As if the walls themselves were trying to absorb the weight of what had happened. I could hear the faint sound of the shower running upstairs. The rhythm of water against tile seemed almost ceremonial, like something being washed away. I got up, moved through the hallway with care, and made my way to the kitchen. The windows were open slightly, and the morning breeze drifted in with a hint of dew and blooming lilac. It was the kind of day I would have once described as beautiful. Now, I didn't know what word to use. He joined me not long after, dressed, clean-shaven, composed. He poured himself a glass of water, glanced at me, then looked away. The air between us was full, not with tension exactly, but with the echo of something too significant to name aloud. We didn't speak. And that silence held more than anything we could have said. He left before noon. A bag slung over his shoulder, keys in hand. He said he had things to take care of. I nodded without asking. There was no need. When he closed the door behind him, I didn't move for a long time. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, both hands resting on the counter, eyes unfocused. Something in me wanted to cry. Not from sadness, but from the sheer release of emotion that had nowhere else to go. I didn't cry. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen. Washed dishes that were already clean. Wiped down surfaces twice. Rearranged a drawer full of utensils I barely used. I needed order. Something I could control. My husband returned later that afternoon. He stepped through the door as if nothing had changed, as if the days apart were nothing more than routine. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if I wanted to go out to dinner that weekend. I told him I'd think about it. He didn't ask about the silence in my voice. Or the absence in my eyes. I watched him unpack his things, move through the house with ease, settling back into the space he considered his own. I followed him from room to room, not with my body, but with my attention, wondering how we had become so practiced at pretending. We shared dinner that night. The conversation was polite, predictable. He spoke about work, about a neighbor's new car, about the grocery store running out of his favorite coffee beans. I responded with small gestures, quiet nods, brief words. He didn't ask how I'd been while he was gone. And I didn't tell him. Later, in bed, he turned off the light and rolled onto his side, facing away from me. I lay still, eyes open, staring into the dark. The ceiling above me felt lower than usual, the air heavier. I wanted to breathe deeply, but my lungs only allowed shallow gulps. He fell asleep quickly, as he always did. His breathing evened out, and soon he was snoring softly. I turned to face the window. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, pale and indifferent. I tried to match my breathing to his. I couldn't. The next morning, I woke up early again. I sat at the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the house breathe. There was something surreal about returning to this version of life, where everything looked familiar but nothing felt the same. Over the next few days, I moved through routines with quiet efficiency. I cooked meals. I watered the plants. I responded to emails. My husband resumed his usual patterns, early mornings, long phone calls, evenings with a glass of scotch and a muted television. We didn't argue. We didn't touch. We existed side by side, like two people waiting for a train that never arrived. He didn't notice the changes in me. Or maybe he did and chose not to ask. I don't know which version of that truth hurt more. I started wearing clothes I hadn't worn in years, things with color, with shape, with memory. I changed my hair, just slightly. I switched perfumes. I started walking every afternoon, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. I told him it helped clear my head. I think he appreciated the quiet. During one of those walks, I stopped by a cafe I hadn't visited in ages. I sat at the corner table, ordered something warm, and stared out the window. People passed by without noticing me. I watched couples walking hand in hand, children laughing, dogs pulling at their leashes. The world moved on, blissfully unaware of the shift in mine. I took out my phone and opened a message thread I hadn't touched in days. I didn't type anything. I just looked at the blank space, then closed it again. That night, I didn't sleep. I got up around midnight and sat on the floor of my closet, surrounded by the scent of old clothes and worn shoes. I reached for a box I hadn't touched in years, filled with photos, handwritten notes, trinkets from another version of my life. I flipped through them slowly, methodically, as if they might hold answers. They didn't. But they reminded me that I had once felt things with depth. With clarity. I went back to bed just before dawn. My husband stirred slightly but didn't wake. I lay beside him, eyes open, listening to the birds begin their early chatter. When he rose and left for work, I stayed behind. The house was mine again, for a few hours. The silence returned. This time, I welcomed it. I made myself coffee, sat by the window, and watched the light shift across the floor. The leaves outside had begun to change color. A subtle transformation. Gradual, quiet. Just like mine. The morning he left was unceremonious. He didn't announce it. There was no farewell dinner, no lingering conversations or searching glances. He simply moved through the house like someone preparing to leave, quietly folding his clothes, zipping up his bag, and gathering what little he had brought with him. It was all done with the same careful precision that had always defined him, calm, efficient, and understated. I watched from the threshold of the hallway as he packed. He noticed me, of course, but didn't stop. He continued folding, straightening, checking drawers. It wasn't avoidance. It was control. A way to keep the pieces from spilling over the edge. When he finally spoke, it was while tightening the strap on his bag. "I'm heading out," he said. His voice was steady, quiet. I nodded once. I didn't ask where. I didn't ask why now. He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't expect one. We stood in silence for a moment longer, the space between us filled with things that had already been said in other ways. Then, he moved toward the door, paused, and turned to me one last time. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cryptic. Just 2 words. Simple. Final. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I only watched him go, and when the door closed behind him, I remained still for a long while, listening to the absence that followed. The house felt larger without him. Not emptier, just wider, quieter, as if the walls themselves had taken a breath. I wandered through the rooms, touching the corners of furniture, smoothing pillows, straightening picture frames that didn't need fixing. These small rituals were all I had now, the only way I knew to make the intangible feel tangible again. My husband returned home a few hours later. He called out a greeting as he stepped inside, voice casual, as if the last few days hadn't existed at all. I answered back with a sound that might have passed for warmth if someone hadn't been listening too closely. He carried groceries into the kitchen, setting them on the counter with a practiced ease. I moved to help him, unpacking cartons of milk, bags of apples, a loaf of bread. We worked in tandem, side by side, without touching. He made a comment about how nice the weather had turned. I nodded. The words passed over me like radio static. That evening, we ate together. He told me a story about someone from work, a minor annoyance that had dragged out over several days. I smiled in the right places. I responded when prompted. But inside, I was elsewhere. Later, after the dishes had been washed and the kitchen had gone still, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. Nothing had changed. The same furniture. The same photographs. The same lighting fixtures casting soft shadows on the floor. And yet, everything felt foreign. I walked to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of novels I hadn't opened in years. Some were dog-eared, others pristine. Each one held a version of me that felt distant now, lives I had once entered through someone else's words, before my own life had become a story I didn't know how to tell. In my bedroom, I opened the closet and stood there for a while, staring at my clothes. I didn't know what I was looking for. Something that felt true. Something that belonged to this new version of me, the one I hadn't chosen but had become nonetheless. I picked out a blouse I hadn't worn in ages, blue, soft, with a neckline I used to like. I put it on and stood in front of the mirror. I looked older than I remembered. Not in a way that hurt, but in a way that was honest. My face had changed. My posture. The way I looked at myself. I left the house the next day. No destination. I just drove. Through neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, past old stores and fading signs, over streets that twisted and narrowed through the edges of town. I didn't listen to music. I let the silence ride beside me. Eventually, I found myself at a small park, the kind with peeling paint on the benches and children's laughter echoing faintly from the playground. I sat near the edge, away from the noise, and watched the wind move through the grass. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages, ones I hadn't deleted, ones I had told myself I would. I read them again, not with longing or shame, but with a quiet clarity. When I returned home, the house was empty again. My husband had gone out, maybe to work, maybe to the store. It didn't matter. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and pulled out my journal. I opened to the last page and reread the lines I had written weeks ago. I'm not sure who I'm becoming. But I know she's not the woman I was. I wrote beneath it. She's also not afraid anymore. I closed the journal slowly, my fingers lingering on the cover. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel destroyed. I felt aware. The following day, I packed away a few things from the guest room. Not much, just linens, books, a few items that didn't belong there anymore. I folded everything with care, placed them in a box, and slid it to the back of the closet. I wasn't erasing anything. I was simply making space. That night, my husband asked if I wanted to watch something on TV. I told him I was tired. He nodded and didn't press. I went upstairs, changed into pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked out the window at the streetlight glowing faintly in the dusk. A couple passed by on the sidewalk, walking close, their hands brushing occasionally. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. I turned off the light and lay down, pulling the blanket over my body. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, breathing in the quiet. I thought about truth. About the pieces we hold back. About the lives we build around them. And then I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to rest. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt like mine.